Okay, so what I'm going to do now is select, say, this second table. You can see its nodes in the Hypergraph. What I'm going to do is go to Edit, Group. Okay, so you can see what happens in the Hypergraph. Basically, those items still exist as individual items, but they've been placed under this group node, similar to placing objects in a folder. I can still individually select them, move them around if I need to, but if I select the group node, it moves as a group. Now, if you notice when that's happened, the center point or the pivot point for the object has moved. To get it back to where it was, what you need to do is select the group node and then go modify center pivot, so it centers it back in the middle of the object. Occasionally it does happen, it's not a big deal, but you need to be aware of how to adjust it if you need to. Okay, so again, the benefit of grouping objects is that sometimes you might want to move it around in the scene. So for example, if I go to rotate, I can rotate that table around even though all the objects are still individual objects. Now, that's not the same as, say, selecting those objects. Again, you can see here in the hypergraph that the objects are selected now, not the group node. So if I go and try to rotate it, you'll notice that each object rotates on its own axis. Okay, so now for the third table, what I'll do is I'll select all the items. Instead of grouping it, I'm going to go to Mesh and go to Combine. Now, this is interesting because what it's done is it's actually flattened, if you like, all the objects into a new object. So if we compare it to the group table, there's the group table. You can clearly see all the individual table items under the group node. But this table here, you'll notice it's a totally new object called polysurface 1. If I need to change the name of it, I'll just call it, say, table, and OK. So there's the center point. I'll just modify center pivot. Again, it's something that usually happens when you group objects. The center point or the pivot point moves to the origin of the grid. It's quite easily fixed if you just center the pivot. Okay, but the interesting thing now in the hypergraph is we can clearly identify the new object, but if you look back here, the previous objects are still sort of around. Basically, this is construction history of the previous state of this table. So it's advisable that once you combine objects into a single new object, what you need to do as the second step is go to the Edit menu, go down to Delete by Type, History. So once I do that, you'll notice that those previous nodes no longer exist. Very similar to construction history in Photoshop, where each step that you do is recorded and occasionally you need to clear the history. With Maya, you need to do that frequently, particularly when you're using certain tools or processes, because it minimizes any issues arising later on. So, good idea to, once you combine objects as the first step, the second step would be to delete history. To finish up, we have 3 tables here. The first table is the individual items, tabletop and the legs. The second table is grouped, so the items are still there, but they're grouped under this group node. And the third table has been combined into a single object. Now, unless you have the hypergraph open, it's sometimes hard to tell what's actually happening. So if you look at this one, that's obviously a separate table, but then this one is as well. So you need to know what's happening under the hood, i.e. in the hypergraph, to be aware of the relationship between the objects. And this one, of course, selected as a single object.